Can you hear me? If you can't hear me, just say no. Okay, that's good. Okay. I hear someone, and I'm not sure if... Okay, I think I can begin now, or I can begin in 1 minute. 9 p.m. sharply. So let me know if you can't hear me or if I should speak slowly. I'm happy to make sure that I'm as clear as possible. Okay, so just as a little introduction, my name is Tessera Crawford. I'm a student at CETA Studio, which is a program at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. I am currently a candidate for the Master of Arts in Computation and Architecture, but I've received my Master of Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. So before I decided to return back to school to study computation, I worked for 3 years in New York City, and I worked for 3 different offices during that period. 2 of them were considered small offices, and one of them was a large one. So the 2 that I worked for previously was Annie Barrett Architecture Studio and Baroque Carai Dumont Architects, and their architecture was much smaller scale, cuter, you would say. And then at some point I worked for Henning Larsen Architects for 1 year. It's a much larger office. It's a Danish-based office, while the other 2 are American. And I enjoyed my time there as well. However, the problem with the reason why I left is because I wanted to return back to school to pursue research in academia or even in practice, because offices like Henning Larsen has research and design departments dedicated to researching for architecture space and for the exterior facade. So I was interested in specifically perception and behavior and how it involves design. And I decided after my thesis and after completing my thesis at the University of California, Berkeley, I at some point made this decision that I was going to spend a few more years in practice working at offices before I decided to go back to school, especially since I've already received my master's. And at the University of California, Berkeley, I studied human perception and how it involved with visualizations, so rendering, for example. And but we didn't study human behavior and rendering in a scientific way. We studied it in a more design-based way. And I pursued programs like CETA, the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Art, in the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, and a interaction program at the Royal College of Art. I was also accepted to other programs like TU Delft in the Netherlands, as well as the University of Stuttgart in Germany, the ITKE program, as well as various other programs all over Europe. But those are the 2, these are the 4 that I was primarily focused on. And one of my questions when I was reapplying to school that I asked myself was basically, who is my reader? And what I realized that my reader was predominantly CETA and predominantly the Royal College of Art, who really focused on scientific-based research. And yes, in the end, the goal is to produce a design in these programs. But what they really focused on was electronics, working with robots, making robots, studying atmosphere and studying space on a scientific level, understanding behavior, human behavior, bacteria behavior, it doesn't really matter. And at some point, I had to really make sure that my portfolio catered to this person who was interested in much more thoughtful and scientific-based approaches. So at the end of the day, the portfolio I'm going to show you and talk about is predominantly about this reader or for this reader. And I recommend that all of you, when you're creating a portfolio, is to really think about who you're making it for and really imagine that person. And I imagine the person to be someone who sits at a desk and solders all day, who codes on their computer, who's really interested in taking many photographs of one thing over the course of time. And unfortunately, since my time at Berkeley and during my time at the workplace, I didn't have that opportunity to cater to this reader. So much of my work had no computation in it. And this is a key thing to remember, that I got into these programs without any computation experience. And it was really how I laid out my portfolio that got me in the first place, because I catered to that idea, even though I didn't have the work to represent it. So this is an example of some of the projects I showed during my application process. I did include another spread specifically for this presentation, but other than that, like, this is mostly the projects I showed them. And I want you to really understand that these projects, when you look at it, you can't, like, you don't think parametric design, you can't really see like, oh, she knows how to use Grasshopper, because I really didn't. I didn't know how to use Grasshopper. I was only familiar with Rhino. I knew how to code HTML and CSS, but those are languages that is not necessary for this specific program. But what I decided to really focus on is, how do I show aspects of computation, show that, and that means I have to express that I'm thoughtful, that I have various studies or numerous studies, or that I really take notes, or show that I note take, or I show elements of like a system. And I predominantly focused on InDesign as a editing software in order to as a graphics tool to really express these aspects of computation that I couldn't show in my work. So this is also my spreads from my professional work, which I decided to eliminate completely from my portfolio during my application process for these programs, because I don't think they really cared. Like, when it came down to it, they were more interested in my personal work. And I do recommend, though, to show projects that you are genuinely interested in, if it came from a practice. So if you produced the project in an architectural office and you felt like it really reflects not only your work, but it kind of showcases what, for example, if you're applying for a computation program and you worked on a lot of simulations at an architectural office, show that, like, is what I'm saying. But you don't have to show all your works. Like, you literally you can select a few. And in my case, I only selected a few, well, there's a lot of projects, but I only had, you could see right here, 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 11 spreads, which is not even a lot. So I asked myself a few questions during the third phase of my portfolio making, and the questions were, should I only show my best images or everything? What is the most important image, and where should I place these images? So the thing is, this is a common question that everyone really asks themselves, which is best image or everything. And I really, and will always generally believe that by incorporating white space, you're able to create a narrative, or you have a control of what the reader is seeing. So I made 2 diagrams. One on the left shows, this one on the left shows what everything could look like. And then this one on the right shows what 3 images can look like on a spread. And if you fill up a page or 2 pages side by side with images, let's assume that some even are just simple diagrams and others are full-blown renders, there would be a lot of things to look at. And the reader will, of course, look at the spread and go like, oh, this is impressive. It's a lot of work. But if you're applying for colleges or universities, in the US or in Europe, I don't think that really works like at all, because at the end of the day it shows that you're presenting the amount of work you have versus showing I'm a designer in this way and I want to show you this render and how it is important to me, and inform, like for example in this I would show this one image and then I would take 2 other images of the project that inform that one image and support it. And this allows the viewer to go like, oh, okay, this begins to tell a story about your idea versus this. It's literally going like, here's a project. So if we really focus on the important image, we can use image hierarchy to develop a story about that important image. So for example, with this spread again, here's image 1, and then here is image 2, and here's image 3. And if we understand that we read the spread from left to right, the viewer will see image 1 first, then image 2, then image 3. But because image 3 is so large, they understand, because with its presence, that it's the most important thing on the page. And from here, they're able to begin to develop a story of that image by looking at these 2 images first, naturally. But then we can think about, how does the location of the image begin to tell different stories? And by working with more white space, we begin to, we're able to move the pictures or these images around. If we consider both image hierarchy, if we consider that there only needs to be a certain amount of images on the page. And this is an example of 4 spreads where it uses the same 3 images or the same ratio over and over again. So this is a medium image on the left-hand corner and a smaller image on the bottom right, and then there's a large image that aligns with both of them, aligns in this way with both of them. And here's another spread where that larger image, or the most important image, fills the page, and then we center these 2 images on the left page to show that it itself has its own presence next to this one, but yet this begins to hint at a sort of like, this is the experience you are having. And then if we focus on this spread, it becomes more playful, where we start thinking, okay, the image doesn't have to be so large, but it should be the largest. It is the most important. But then we have this medium one, and then this much smaller one right next to one another at the lower portion of this page. And we begin to have this understanding that instead of the bigger image and completely encompassing the person's perception of the narrative or their tone or understanding of your portfolio, it begins to hint at, okay, this spread is important, but it's not too important. And you can do the same even with this spread, but focusing it on the center. So while these pull the images apart, this one focuses everything in the center, and then it creates a different sort of importance. It's still saying same size images, but this one becomes more important simply because of the way you lay it out. So really take note of the reader and what they're experiencing as they're viewing these pages and these different layouts, because it really tells a story. And you have to understand that when a person is reading these pages, they're viewing it in an order, and then they also feel the presence of something else, which is the larger image. And it's like understanding your eyeball and how we have our side view and then our front view. We can see everything around it, but the focus is where we're looking at, and usually that's the most important image, but everything else surrounding it can either distract us or it can help support what's happening. So when it comes down to it, I encourage to begin laying out your portfolio the best way you can. Do not consider the order of your projects. Just start laying out one spread. and let your interests set the precedent for future layouts. So for example, with this spread, I have 2 renders, 4 elevations, and a site plan. And I had 2 other renders and a lot of other line drawings for this project, which was a competition that my friend and I worked on. But I chose not to show that because I really didn't like the other 2 renders, and I felt like the other line drawings didn't inform the spread specifically. So at the end of the day, I chose my best images, I placed them on a spread, and then I kept moving them around until it sort of felt right. And it felt right because I imagined myself as the reader, and that's what you always have to really focus on, is you pretend you're somebody else and you're looking at your page, and then it's like looking at it and then just imagining like what will they see first. And when you open this page, I would imagine that the first 2 things you see is this one and this one, and the reason why is because they're darker and they're more colorful, but they begin like this because this one is much larger and it literally hugs the page side by side, but this one is floating. So those things can catch your eye very quickly. And then these line drawings, which are mute, they're just simple black and white line drawings, begin to support the images above it and below it. So in the case of this site plan, it's showing the location of the site, which is in Bumbang Bay in Indonesia, and then the villages in relationship to it, which is Awang Bay and Kuta Bay. And then right above it is the actual drone shot I did in Indonesia of the location of where this bird cage was going to be placed. And then from there, I worked with some elevation drawings, very simple, because it was a very simple project. And then I placed them above this interior view. And the reason why is because we really don't know how the building looks like. And at the end of the day, like, I felt like that is an important thing. And I felt like if the reader saw the spread and didn't know how it looked like and only saw interior views, it would be slightly frustrating. So I hinted at it by producing more drawings. In this spread, it's much simpler. There's only 3 images. And this was an important project to show because I felt like it was one of my more interesting plans material-wise. It had more layers of material that you could see in the plan that my other projects didn't have. And I also produced an exploded axonometric of the pool, and this is a pool. And I also did light studies on this using a software called Diva. From there, I also produced other renders and other drawings, tons more drawings than this. But the issue I came across was that I lost all that work. I lost the majority of that work. All I had were these 3 images. And someone is probably going to encounter this once in their life as a student of architecture. They're going to lose stuff. And that is what happened to me. And I had to accept that as a part of my life. So I was like, okay, how do I work with these 3 images to produce a very clear spread that in itself was grounded in those 3 images? And I decided to fill the spread with the images, and that's what I did here, where I filled this first page with the plan, and I made sure to make the background gray to clearly set a ground. And then from there, I had my exploded axon, which I then pulled out text on the side onto the white space, so it felt like it was a part of this layout. And then from there, I placed this conceptual render of the pool, which was the only render I had left since the loss. And this was one of my initial render studies of this project. And I placed it underneath the axon, and then I put a text on the side. And I felt like this was able to create a story that here is a plan, and I feel like this plan is the most important thing, and this is what I'm telling the reader. But this is why it's important. It's because there's a layer of materials that are involved in the construction of this pool, and that was the point of the studio, is to study that layering of different materials. And then here is a render of how it should feel like in a forest. And that was the point of this project, and thankfully I had at least these 3 images to show that. So what I'm saying is that you don't need to redo your whole project from start if you lose something. You can edit your existing work, improve on it or not improve on it, and just make sure that layout really tells that story. And the person who's looking at your spreads will not think, oh, there should be more drawings. That never happens unless literally they don't know what they're looking at. But if they see a plan, an axon, and a render, they're like, okay, that's enough to express what's going on. And so don't really stress over this, which is a common issue that I notice that happens with students, is they worry if they have enough on a spread. These 3 images were enough for me. And then I worked on this 3rd spread, which was a really interesting collection of different objects that I liked in the last 2 years of my studies in Berkeley. And these were really done from 3 different projects. So there was this project, which was a diptych, which is two sculptures side by side, where I was just showing, oh, look at how the material does this when I mix it with this material. And that's really what I was just doing, and it was just a study that I really liked. And then from there, I also, in a separate project, made some random models, and they were all with wire and plaster, and I really liked it, so I wanted to put it into the spread. And I really liked this image because it was so quiet, it was so minimal. And then with this drawing, I felt like these begin to like have a similar kind of aesthetic between one another. So this drawing, I produced again another project, and I combined them all in one spread. And I encourage you, if you're applying for like an art program or applying for an architecture program in an art school, to have a spread like this with random objects you made. And you could, and that's what I did with this, is I tried to express, here are 3 random objects that I have on a spread. And whenever I asked people about this spread, they always said, yes, actually, yeah, it clearly reads like 3 random objects, but the common thing that they all share, so it feels like a cohesive spread, was the colors. And that is a key thing. It's making sure that if you have a bunch of different things coming together in one spread, that at least the colors are similar. And this will help like draw the eye through easily without being extremely like confused or disoriented about the spread. So I'm going to take you through my thought process for how I lay out all my portfolios. Really, when it comes to document size, this is one of the most important things. I use a letter or an A4, which is really the size right here. And the reason why I choose this size is because I know this is a comfortable size for people when they print. It's a size they know. It's affordable. People can easily just print it out like that. And what's also important is when you put those 2 sizes together, you get a tabloid or an A3, which is this size. And if the way I see it is, if people don't have the page and they only have paper for a tabloid, they can at least print the spreads. And it's really like a simple reason why I chose a document size is I really thought about the reader, and I thought about how convenient it is for them to print it out in the office, anywhere they feel like to. Because if it was a different kind of size, it wouldn't be as convenient, and it would be slightly frustrating for the person who's viewing your portfolio, because as a person who had to view portfolios myself when I was working at these small architecture offices, one of my duties was to go through intern applications, and we would either view them digitally on the computer or we would print them. And usually we would receive some strange paper sizes or document sizes that I guess express the designer's intent, but because it was so difficult to print, or it was just so like, if it was too big, the drawings looked weird. Like if they did like some small pages side by side, like squares, and then you would print them really large on a letter, and it would make their portfolio look bad. Or like if it was too long and thin, then it would make the drawing so small when it would print on a letter or an A4. And these are things that you have to be aware of, that reality is reality. And this is something that I seriously recommend, is that you consider your document size in a more honest and clear way, because the world works in very specific ways, and unfortunately letter and A4 is that. And as you can see here, this is a sort of diagram that begins to express why it's important, because if you have two letters or A4s side by side one another on a 15-inch laptop screen, it really can help fill out the laptop screen. And this is just an approximate, but at the end of the day, like, it really fills up the laptop screen, and you don't want to be seriously digitally like filling out the laptop screen where you're trying to find the perfect size that does that, because someone will print it. So you have to consider that too. And here's another thing. Usually people want to rotate the page, so each page is in landscape versus portrait. And what I recommend really not to do that. And the reason why is when a person, the person who's basically looking at your application opens up the documents on their computer, the white space decreases. As you can see here, this is A, and then I use the same line and I place it here, and A is much larger than B, and that's what's going to happen, is you're going to lose image information and you're going to make everything much smaller. So the goal is, we want to see your drawings and we really want to look at them, and by decreasing that opportunity, it's not really productive. At the end of the day, it is fine if you do a landscape letter or a A4, but just consider that to fit a horizontal image, if you have more horizontal images than portrait images onto horizontal page sheets, you'll notice that at the end of the day, those images are going to get smaller anyway. So I recommend cropping. It's my best friend. I crop all the time. By cropping an image, you're already telling the viewer that you have control over your images and your drawings, and you're using InDesign or whatever program as another type of graphics tool. And it's no different from Photoshop or Illustrator. You're showing that you have control over those images in every way possible, and that they don't control or dictate your document size. And this is an example of that, where this render here was much longer. This was a very long render, because as you can see here in the site plan, this is a very long garden. And what I made sure is like to emphasize that this also was a very long render, but what I did was I place the images that were being cropped along the edge of the page, like here, so I could tell the reader who's viewing this spread, these are cropped drawings. I'm cropping them here because I want you to focus on this, if that makes sense. And then it's the same here, where I cropped here and here and here because I wanted them to focus on the path, and I wanted them to focus on these like glass boxes that are like existing in space. Another great thing with InDesign is you can implement, or other softwares, you can implement lines or you can add text. And that's what I did with this spread, is where we wrote a poem of the garden, and the poem I wrote on top of the site plan because I wanted to follow the not only the movement of the site plan, but I also wanted to draw attention to the poem, because usually if you write a bunch of text, some people don't read it, and I really wanted this to be read. So I thought if I place it in an interesting way and in a way that follows the drawing, people will understand its importance and attempt to read it. And also I wanted to be more interesting, where I also laid lines down vertically and then I numbered them, so it was conflicting with the horizontal lines of the text. So these spreads here, for example, are images that intrude onto one another, and this is completely okay. Like, I support layering images, I support layering text and lines. It's really fun. And I'm going to show you like another booklet that a friend of mine worked on that does this, and I think it's a great thing to show. So you'll see that later. Here is a series of spreads where the images respect one another, where you have the large image here, and then you have smaller images beside it that refer to it. None of the images are intruding onto one another. And it happens here as well, where there's a large image and then there's these smaller images referring to one another, and in the end, they're respecting each other's presence on the page. So when it comes down to it, each of these spreads I just showed you all follow two types of grids. If we see a page, the width of a page as U, and we see the length of a page as V, and then again, one spread is 2 U's and 1 V. We can begin to divide these. So what I did is, for one spread here, I divided it into halves, or of 2's, and this is 1/2 U, 1/2 U, 1/2 U, 1/2 U by 1/2 V, 1/2 V, 1/2 V, and so on. It's a very simple grid, and then I did a similar thing here, but instead of halves, I did by thirds. So we have 2/3 U by 1/3 V, then 2/3 U by 2/3 V, and then 2/3 V by 2/3 U, and so on, as you can understand. Again, this is a spread here, and this is the center of that spread, which is 2 pages side by side. In the end, what I did is I didn't really follow the grid perfectly, and if you do, it will be bad, because then you'll be struggling to make sure that you're in the grid, and then it's going to be an uninteresting spread because everyone knows you're following a grid. And the point is, you're supposed to implement your own personal taste, your own design decisions during the process of developing your portfolio. And what I recommend is to increase your grid's tolerance. And by increasing your grid's tolerance, you form rules as you lay out your first few spreads. And like in this case, like if we look at this one, it's very simple. Center text between intersection. Center image between intersection. And then if we look at this spread here, what I did is I expressed cropped images along the edge of the page, right here and here. And then if they're not cropped, I didn't do that. And then another thing I did was, this isn't within a cell at all. It is centered along this line. But what I decided to do is like, okay, what if this page and this grid was mirrored along here? Then now I can fit it into a cell. And then I did the same here, where, okay, what if this cell, what if this axis was mirrored along the length of this page? which is then I can fit this here. So this was like an imaginary dialogue I had with myself. At the end of the day, I was subdividing this cell into twos. As you can see, I quartered it. And this allowed me to visualize a sort of like, I created a story or a way of placing all these images onto the spreads. And here is another one where I kept the image somewhat in the cell, but I allowed them to move off it. And then here I centered the image at the intersection as the one before it. And for here, I had another rule where if a text and images were in one cell and a diagram was in another cell, and then I had this render, I could leave the cell or increase the size of the image so it lined up with these three images. And this is just like, these are rules you make up on your own. And it's a way of increasing the grid's tolerance, allowing you to, shift away from the grid. And it really helps begin to like quickly place down images, because you're like, okay, if I have to put big images here, then I put them big here, and then small ones here and small ones here. And it's like just a way of like playing with your portfolio. And here is a zoom into one of the projects I worked on, which is just this little house. And I was focusing on Eisenman's techniques. But the reason why I showed this project is because in computation you really focus on the parts of the form, and that's what I did here to show that. And I placed the most important image here, but this was also important, and as you can see, I played with that, where even though this is the largest image, this had the smallest elements within the image. And because this is one of the smaller images, the medium-sized image, I zoomed in much more in order to really emphasize its presence within its cropped view. And then in this case, I use these as smaller icons on the page, so we begin to understand what is in this site plan, and we can understand what this plan is. This is all conceptual. I just did it really for fun during my 3 years at work. But yeah. Then again here, it's the location of the image. I placed the larger image along this side of the page. And then I placed these two smaller images between the center of the spread and then this line. And then I placed these two models on the left cell, and the reason why I did this is because I wanted to tell this story where, yes, to me this is the most important image, and I know based on, we see dark things first, so I know people are going to automatically be drawn to the darkest image on this spread because everything is gray. So I decided, okay, I will let you see this first. And that's what I did. I placed it in the first cell. And then I placed the diagram, which is the shirt diagram, right beside it, very close that they're overlapping. And I did this so I can make the eyes go from this side down to the diagram and draw those eyes there. So then you're left with this one photograph. And the goal is for me to express to the reader, this is important to me. And it's simply that. I am trying to control what the reader is seeing, how they're experiencing the spread, knowing that people are drawn to dark things and they want to see the most brightest or darkest thing on the page. And it's like, how do you take advantage of that and use it so you could draw the person through the series of pages in your portfolio. And then here is another project I worked on recently. This is still being worked on, but I'm studying bacteria in CETA. I was studying bacteria in CETA, and I'm using the methodologies that I helped develop during this workshop for a research that I'm working on at the moment. And I decided to create this spread because I'm applying to internships where it's about indoor farming, and at the end of the day, I thought this was very important because it shows that I know computation, or I am learning computation. And what I learned from this spread is you could have numerous images and make them feel bigger by putting a background on them and adding text into the image. So this is why I'm showing you this. So when you're ordering the projects, I want you to consider narrative structure over chronological order. And the narrative structure I worked out, that I refer to as the most common one, which starts with an exposition. There's a rising action, and from there a climax, and then a falling action, and then we have the end. And the exposition for me is your letter and resume, or my letter and resume. And for my portfolio, at my rising action, the first part of the rising action, I showed relatable work. So since I'm applying to an architecture program, I'm going to put some architecture work in there. And because it's not computation per se, I'm not going to focus on my relatable work. So it's not going to be at the climax. I'm going to place it at the beginning. And then when we get to the climax, from the rising action to the falling action, we have the more exciting drawings, the more weird, interesting stuff that really is not relevant to where it's not relevant to architecture per se. Well, it is important because it's a representation, but the buildings aren't complete. They're just thoughts. And the reason why I made those my climax, these exciting drawings, is because I'm applying to a computation program that requires a lot of prototyping, that requires a lot of quick thinking, and in that case I placed them in the middle, and I only showed what I felt like were my best images at the time. And then from there I ended with my research interest, which is my thesis. And this was an important decision because I knew that by the time the people reached those pages, they could either be, they should be excited at that moment, where I should have perked their interest again by now, that they would actually focus on my research. Because if I put my research interests first, that would be really boring. Like, I would have probably lost the person from the beginning. And I don't intend to do that. And I don't believe anyone wants to do that. So when I'm ordering the projects, I consider boredom. Like, people get bored. And I draw it as a curve that's falling. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to take that center of that curve and pull it up. So we keep their interest as much as possible. And like, you want to put your most exciting work in the middle next to what you consider, right before you consider your almost best work, or your more, more in-depth or text-based work. And here is those spreads. So we have the more relatable work, which is the architectural drawings that any architect understands. Then we have the more, you would say, exciting stuff, which is unique and it's just different and it's kind of like weird. And those are my representation focused projects. And then here we have thesis, which is just a bunch of light studies for me and a bunch of information-based drawings, which could easily bore someone in the beginning because they don't know what they're looking at. It's just a bunch of light or pink renders. So what I want to say is to remember a few things, which is grid, visual hierarchy, especially with images and text. Cropping the image is perfectly okay. And tolerances or rules you give yourself when you're laying out images along a grid. But I would like you to consider other things like sketches, sizing your text differently, color, photographs that are your photographs, and intruding into the margin, which is the edge of the page. And I'm going to show you some work from my friend Sixten Ditlevsen. He just created a booklet. It's like a portfolio of for his midterm review, which is a series of photographs he took at Calais in France. And this is a spread of one of those in his booklet, which is a photograph he took and he wrote on the image with white text, showing a quote, showing a quote of someone that wrote to him in an email. And then with that, he used various sizes, which is spaces of myth, to explain this image very simply. And I wanted to show you these spreads because they're interesting. And you shouldn't be afraid to have one image on a spread. And this is an example of that, where you can use an image and text side by side, where the text doesn't draw you away from the image, but then the text has its own importance. And it's extremely dynamic and exciting. And here are other spreads he worked on, which is really interesting as well, which emphasizes, these are all photographs he took on a camera, but he shows that you can combine photographs with text together in an image, and it will be extremely exciting and interesting to just flip through, because visually you're focused on the image. And then here's another one. And then there's something interesting he did here, where he took another photograph and he overlapped it with this photograph, which I thought is extremely interesting. And I don't know how you would consider that in a portfolio, but guys, this is something you should take note of. But like, other than that, I hope these spreads as well inspire you guys to look into laying out in a more minimal way, in a daring way, which is this way, which I haven't really considered. But this is something that it should also be considered as an option, and feel free to like screenshot them. And then yeah, that's about it. So if you have any questions, like, feel free to ask me. We have, I believe, 13 minutes left, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Application story and useful tips for making the portfolio and how to polish it. It is really helpful indeed. So let us give the students for about 5 minutes or 15 minutes to ask the questions.
For sure.
If they have some questions, we could answer them, and we can tell something more about the light courses afterwards.
Right, for sure. Oh,
Hello， 同学们，刚才 Tessera 老师跟我们分享了很多关于他做作品集这个整个的过程，还有他分享了他自己的一些故事，包括像整个作品集里面需要加入到一些叙事性的表现，还有对光的控制以及排版的一些小的细节要求，相信大家也有很多的想法。所以目前的话，我们可以给大家5到10分钟的时间进行提问。如果有对作品集需要提升，或者是不知道怎么去调整的同学们，现在可以抓住这个时间去向老师进行提问了。
Regarding the question, could you share your portfolio with us? I'm not sure if I can, but I can definitely compile my spreads into a much clearer, into separate spreads onto a page so people can view it. But I think I showed majority of them here on my presentation, but it's really up to you if that's okay. I'm not really familiar if that's possible.
Well, actually, after this lecture, we will have a review about the whole of the lecture.
Okay.
In this promotion,
right?
Yeah, in this promotion article, we will put your for example, the screenshot of your portfolio so that people
Okay.
can see it.
Amazing. Then yes, I can share it.
海豚同学，就是咱们的作品集老师的这个截图哈，之后会放到咱们的这个关于公开课的回顾课程里面，在公众号的文章里面会有老师的作品，希望到时候的话可以帮到你。
And then there's this question, does the portfolio seem more artistic, more likely to get an offer? If you're referring to the first portfolio and the last one, I would say that they're not, the first one isn't really as artistic as the second one, but I know from my experience and from everyone that I know that creates portfolios, I've received a lot of offers with the portfolio I showed you of my work, a lot, and I've gotten to programs I didn't think I would get into simply because I thought that some of my spreads were too artistic, but at the end of the day I still was accepted to them. So I don't really think it's about how technical your drawings are or about how much work you have done, but it's really about how you tell how you talk about your project through images. And if a person who's reading your portfolio sees that you have a good control of that, then I think that they have confidence in literally the fact that you're able to present your work, and that in itself is extremely important. What if it's a multi-story building? It's quite hard, just show 2-3 photos. So if it's a multi-story building, I do recommend that you should have spreads that are more open to having a lot more images. Like at the end of the day, not all the spreads should be minimal, and not all your spreads should be like the last portfolio I showed you. Like, you don't want all your portfolio spreads to look like this. So what I'm suggesting is you can have one spread that looks like this, or 2 spreads that look like this, but you can have much more complex spreads. Like you could have 3 spreads, or a small portion of them explaining a much more complicating project with much more images involved. But what I'm trying to tell as a lecturer is you do not need many spreads with many drawings, because at the end of the day it's so overwhelming for the reader to see just a lot of images. And I hope that answers your question. I think it should be a variety of different layouts. You said for applying for graduate school, how many projects would be appropriate? Because I see people put everything in from freshman year to thesis. It's interesting. So I applied to graduate school with 5 years of my work, but 3 years of that, I only produced 2 projects because I wasn't in school then. So most of my work was 4 to 5 years old. So when I chose my projects, I decided, okay, if they were the most important thing, I would have more spreads for them. So in my case, as you can see here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 projects in my portfolio, and one of them has 3 spreads, and another one has 2 spreads, while the rest only has 1 spread. And the way I decided it is really how much images I have for that project. So in the case of some projects, I had more images, and so because there was more white space, I gave them 3 spreads to use. It was really just extremely logical. At the end of the day, I didn't use any of my bachelor's work, and that's because I was applying with a master already. but because a lot of people are applying with just a bachelor's, and you have 4 years of work from my application to Berkeley, I only used 2 years of my work, and that's because we produce in 2 years 6 projects. So for my application to Berkeley, I showed 6 projects. So and because of that, I was able to similar layout as this, but each project would have 3 spreads or 2 spreads. So then again, if you have less projects, you can have more spreads, because at the end of the day, no one really wants to look at 30 pages or 30 spreads. It can be exhausting. Again, I only showed 15 at most. It says, next question. Thanks for your sharing. You showed quite a lot of works in one portfolio, and there are 3 sections. Do you think that it's appropriate to show each work, or you think the relation between works are more important? Do you mean as in show all my projects? Can you explain that one question? But the second question, or you think the relation between works more important? Yeah, the relationship between works are actually really important, and I do stress this because in my case, that when I showed them in sections, I was trying to draw the reader from an architectural project to a more representation-based project. So as you can see here on this slide, we have these 3 architecturally focused projects, and then I drew them using this architectural yet exploring drawing as a way to do this second section of you could say less architectural work, or representationally like representation heavy work. And from there I was able to draw them into the thesis portion. And the reason why I drew them into the thesis portion is I made sure that this project had colors similar to this project. So when I was going from work to work, I really thought about the colors. I thought about like not only the colors, but how like how do I say this? It's not only the colors, but how the reader visually how do I say this? Like going from architectural, when you look at this slide here, which is here, let me go to it so it's clear. So this slide, it's geometry based, and because architects are familiar with geometry, I placed this in between this project here and this project here. And then from something that had more circles, I went into a project with a lot of circles. So it's like really basic, sort of like, it's like I'm taking advantage of the person's eye and how they view forms and colors. And that's how I transition between one work to another. And if that didn't answer your question, feel free to like ask again. And then the next question is, how do you weigh the importance of diagrams? Because I've seen how different people from different countries treat them. Diagrams are important. They really are, but it depends on how you draw them. There are some diagrams that are much more similar to Big. So Big's diagrams, for example, which is really, I guess people refer to them in my side, in the US and in currently the country I live in right now, which is Denmark, as like dumb diagrams. And those are really not pleasing to see in a portfolio unless they're really beautiful. And then there's more informative diagrams, which are like much more complex, and those are useful to show. So if you have like diagrams that shows a process of thoughts, put them in. It's really important. But if it's just like if it's just used to show I did this, like I rotated the building this way so it hits the sun, I don't recommend putting them in there unless they're really small, because the amount of information you're showing is probably really little anyway, and it's okay to get away with them if you make them as small as possible. And usually if you have those kind of diagrams, it's okay to overlay them over the render. So if you have a large render and you have a lot of like sky space, like let's say you have a render of a building and there's a sky and there's a lot of sky, and you have these diagrams that explain how the form is developed, and they're really simple line diagrams, you could place them over the render in white or something, like just so like it balances well with the render, so it informs the render without taking white space. Does that make sense? And a person can look at that and really think, okay, these aren't that important, but they really do express what this form is making. Because at the end of the day, you should think of white space as sort of gold in many ways. Like it's like extremely, extremely, extremely valuable, and you don't want to get rid of it just to have more information. You want to get rid of it if there's importance in many ways. So it's okay to overlap drawings on top of one another, is what I'm really saying. I hope that answered your question. Welcome. You're welcome, and everyone said thank you. Okay, so there are times where you need to do site analysis, and that's if the project you're working on is extremely, extremely devoted to site analysis. So I agree with you that I didn't really show a lot of site analysis in my work, but I should have shown site analysis in one of them, which is this project here. It's this birdhouse one. And I'm right now developing a spread, like a whole 2 pages dedicated to that. So yes, it is important if the work needs it, if that makes sense. And like, it could be photographs you take of the site that you're putting side by side together and writing a bunch of text on it, like notes. Or it could even just be a real map, like a mapping of the site and there was a reason why you chose that location. So yes, site analysis is only important if you really believe it's necessary to the project. But other than that, you do not need a site analysis drawing for every project you put in your portfolio. Like it is really not necessary if it's not really that important. Like, and I can swear on that. But yes, if it's important, it's important. You should put it in. So don't worry about not having it. Yeah, if you genuinely just think it's necessary, then put it in. But if it's not necessary and it doesn't inform your project, don't put it in.
Is there any other questions? 还有其他问题吗，同学们？
What's your thought about the research part? Usually the research part is like a investigation in something you've done. Some people might have it, some people might not have it, but it's usually a material class you take where it investigates a material or a light or anything really. In my case, it was light studies. I was making a space invisible. Technically, I was making it all pink, and I didn't put that in the beginning just because it wasn't, no one would get it if I put it in the beginning. But since I put it in the end, it became, as they transitioned through the portfolio, they began to understand why I did this thesis, if that makes sense. But in your case, it could be anything. Or you don't even need to have it. It could be your favorite project, could be the last project. But for me, it was my thesis was my favorite project, so but it was.
Okay, Tessera, thank you so much for sharing your very interesting takes and your stories about how to polish the portfolio to us. It is really honor to have you here today. And we are really looking forward for your light courses afterwards in June, starting in June. And let's expect it.
Yes.
Hello，同学们，我们今天的这个课程呢就分享到这儿，非常感谢大家的参与哈。咱们这样的一系列的作品集课程之后，我们会陆续的开展很多，这些课程都是免费的。到时候我们可以在咱们的这个老师的课程群里面可以跟大家分享，希望大家可以随时的关注。我把老师的这个二维码发给大家，大家感兴趣的话可以扫一下。之后有任何的问题，关于作品集的课程的问题，还有关于留学方面的问题的话，都可以随时随地跟老师进行交流。此外的话呢，咱们的这个课程，包括今天的咱们的这个录屏课，都会在 B 站进行发布。咱们的课程呢，可以在 B 站搜索“辉格留学”就可以找到我们。之后大家可以无限次的去 review。同时的话呢，咱们机构也是提供专业的作品集到留学全方位的服务的。今天很开心哈，看到了很多我之前的这个学生也参与到咱们的课程来，所以之后大家有任何的问题都欢迎和我们的这个服务号的小助手老师进行沟通和联系，也希望我们可以提供更多更好的课程提供给大家。那我们今天的这个分享就进行到这儿，好吗？Thank you for joining us today and have a nice night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Tessera. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.